Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a short chat about the kind of culture and pop culture context around historical figures. So the Classics and Company reading group is reading Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian, or Memoirs of Hadrian, this month and a half. And I've been doing some side reading because I'm curious, in part about the actual history. What I'm really curious about, and I'm realizing is harder to find out, is how that period of history was viewed when this book was actually written. Now, it was written over a series of 20 years, so that gets a little awkward, but it was published in the early 50s, and what did people then, at that time, know about that period of Roman history? And I don't know, but if you know the answer to that, I'd be curious to hear it. But the bigger thing that I was thinking was I was reading Hadrian, Empire and Conflict. Now, this is a book that is a tie-in to a British Museum exhibit from 2008. And the author, who's the curator of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum, has a whole section, like a good page and a half, where he talks about how people have read this novel, and this novel has become their knowledge about the period in history. So their knowledge isn't coming from actual historical texts, or whether it's contemporary works or modern histories, it's from this work of fiction. And what's really interesting is he talks about how specific to her era this was, how even though this was published in the early 50s, it was written in the interwar period originally and sort of reinvented post-Second World War, and how much that has an impact on what she's written as opposed to the actual history. Because the actual memoirs of Hadrian or Adrianus, whichever name you want to use, existed but didn't survive. I was going to say it didn't survive to the modern age. They didn't survive antiquity as far as we know. We get bits and pieces that were either referenced by other people, and I think there's a section that was found that had been rewritten as a writing exercise for students at one point, but we don't know what was in there. And people read this book and assume that they do, which is really interesting and funny. But also, thinking about that, when I went into this novel thinking, well, I know everything that happens because I've seen Rufus Wainwright's opera that is loosely based on this. And I think if you've seen an opera adaptation of anything, you know that they strip a lot of the story out of it. Incidentally, that opera has too much brass. It should have been done as a neo-Baroque opera, and it's not one. That's what would have been better. Anyway, no one cares. My point, though, is that even though I'm aware and I'm thinking about like this writer saying, don't take your fiction to be history, I'm assuming that I know something about both the history and about this novel because I've seen this adaptation. And similarly, as I'm reading this, and the character at one point, he's a bit of a Grecophile, and he's seeing a shrine for Alcibiades, and who I'm aware of as a historical figure, but who I mostly associate with the version of him that appears in the video game Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where he teaches your main character, Cassandra or Alexios, about the politics in Greece of his era and about goat sex. So that is the first thing I think of. And so again, am I thinking of this video game instead of actual history? And the answer is probably yes, because when I'm reading through this, I am thinking, oh, that's like the opera. Oh, that he's referencing this bit of something that was already history and in his time, which I know about mostly because of this video game. And I think that's fun, because my context right now is obviously not the same context in which Yourcenar wrote this book, because obviously people were not thinking about an opera and a video game that did not exist in those days. So what's really interesting to think about is what was the context in those days? Like, what was your average Francophone reader or your average Anglophone reader? Because this is actually, like I always say, the best translations come from people's either children or partners, and Grace Frick, who translated this, was Marguerite Yourcenar's partner. And so you think, okay, she obviously okayed this and knew the voice, so it's not one of those books where I'm going to critique the translation, although that is interesting, and I would hold that up, but I don't know where I put it. So one of these days, because actually the Folio Classique edition has a more thorough set of historical notes in the back than the Penguin Classics one does, which is always the case. This is a side thing. It's a side thing, but not exactly, because that means even now, an Anglophone or Francophone reader is going to go into a book like this from a similar kind of publisher and get different information out of the back, right? Because if there are more notes, which is true in the Folio Classique edition, you're going to come away from the reading experience versus somebody who just reads the Penguin Classics edition with more context, both to the writer and to the subject matter, right? So that's interesting too. Anyway, this rambly discussion is just me asking you, when you're reading historical fiction, do you think about, or even argue with the text itself, about what really happened or what didn't happen, or this is unknown, or that timeline is compressed? Or are you thinking about outside things, like I've seen the TV series that dealt with that, or a film, or an opera, or a video game, or whatever. I'd love to hear how your cultural experience impacts your reading of historical fiction, and whether that makes it more fun or less fun, because I felt like I was entertained by how many elements that are in here have kind of a recognition value to things that wouldn't have existed in the popular consciousness, or that just didn't exist yet at all when this book was written, because I think that's really interesting, and I'd love to hear if other people are thinking about that and what specifically you think about that. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.